Welcome to the next edition of a BCI-based Cybersecurity Institute webinar. Today we're going to be talking about cryptocurrencies and security, which is a topic that I find super interesting and have been following for a long time. And I will go ahead and get started. BCI, just to give a little history about BCI, was founded in honor of Becky Bass, who was an internationally recognized leader in cybersecurity. She really was a visionary in her field. And one of the things she was really good at was bringing together people in different aspects of cybersecurity to create more than the individual parts. And that's one of the things that we want to continue here at BCI. We have 4 pillars: education, research, technology, and public policy. And this webinar series is part of our educational initiative to reach out. If there are topics that you find interesting, we welcome the feedback. Feel free to write us or leave us comments. And if you have any questions during it, also the same. We should have some time at the end of the talk to have questions, but if anything we don't get to, just go ahead and write us, and we would love to engage in a dialogue about anything on cybersecurity. To get started today, I'm going to hand it over to David Rosenthal, and he's going to start us off talking about cryptocurrencies. Thank you, David.
Okay, let me do the. Okay. Okay. So I remember Becky well from the Cellular Microcomputer workshop, so I'm grateful to Mark Cummings for his invitation. You don't need to take notes. When I stop talking, the text of my talk with links to the sources and much additional material will be at blog.dshr.org. I'm aiming to talk for 30 minutes. Please hold questions. Before I start talking about cryptocurrencies, I should stress that I hold no long or short positions in cryptocurrencies, their derivatives, or related companies. I am long NVIDIA. Unlike most people discussing them, I'm not talking my book. Cryptocurrencies' roots lie deep in the libertarian culture of Silicon Valley and the cypherpunks. Libertarianism's attraction is based on ignoring externalities, and cryptocurrencies are no exception. Bitcoin is notorious for consuming as much electricity as the Netherlands, but there are around 10,000 other cryptocurrencies, most using similar infrastructure and thus also in aggregate consuming unsustainable amounts of electricity. Bitcoin alone generates as much e-waste as the Netherlands. Cryptocurrencies suffer an epidemic of pump and dump schemes and wash trading. They enable a 5.2 billion a year ransomware industry. They've disrupted supply chains for GPUs, hard disks, SSDs, and other chips. They've made it impossible for web services to offer free tiers, and they're responsible for a massive crime wave, including fraud, theft, tax evasion, funding of rogue states such as North Korea, drug smuggling, and even, as documented by Jameson Lopp's list of physical attacks, armed robbery, kidnapping, torture, and murder. The attempt to force El Salvador's population to use cryptocurrency is a fiasco. They offer no significant social benefit beyond speculation. Igor Makarov and Antoinette Schur write, 90% of transaction volume on the Bitcoin blockchain is not tied to economically meaningful activities, but is the byproduct of the Bitcoin protocol design, as well as the preference of many participants for anonymity. Exchanges play a central role in the Bitcoin system. They explain 75% of real Bitcoin volume. Our results do not support the idea that the high valuation of cryptocurrencies is based on the demand for illegal transactions. Instead, they suggest that the majority of Bitcoin transactions is linked to speculation. Bitcoin is only processing around 27,000 economically meaningful transactions a day, and 75% of those are transactions between exchanges. So only 25% of the transactions are real blockchain-based transfers involving individuals. That's less than 5 a minute. Nakamoto's motivation for Bitcoin was distrust of institutions, especially central banks. When it launched in the early stage of the global financial crisis, this had resonance. The key to a system that involves less trust is decentralization. So why do suspension bridges have stranded cables, not solid rods? The major reason is that solid rods would fail suddenly and catastrophically, whereas stranded cables fail slowly and make alarming noises while they do. We build software systems out of solid rods. They fail abruptly and completely. Changing this, making systems that are resilient, ductile like copper, not brittle like glass, is an extraordinarily difficult problem in software engineering. I got interested in it when, burnt out after 3 startups, all of which IPO'd, I started work at the Stanford Library on the problem of keeping digital information safe for the long term. This work won my co-authors and I a Best Paper Award at the prestigious 2003 Symposium on Operating System Principles for a decentralized consensus system using proof of work. When 5 years later, Satoshi Nakamoto published the Bitcoin protocol, a cryptocurrency based on a decentralized consensus mechanism using proof of work, I was naturally interested in how it turned out. Decentralization is a necessary but insufficient requirement for system resilience. Centralized systems have a single locus of control. Subvert it, and the system is at your mercy. It only took 6 years for Bitcoin to fail Nakamoto's goal of decentralization, with one mining pool controlling more than half the mining power. In the 7 years since, no more than 5 pools have always controlled a majority of the mining power. In 2014, I wrote Economies of Scale in Peer-to-Peer Networks, explaining the economic cause of this failure. Briefly, it's an example of the phenomenon described by W. Brian Arthur in 1994's increasing return and path dependence in the economy. Information technologies have strong economies of scale. So the larger the miner, the lower their costs, and thus the greater their profit, and thus the greater their market share. Blockchain is unfortunately a term used to describe 2 completely different technologies which have in common only that they both use a Merkle tree data structure. Permissioned blockchains have a central authority controlling which network nodes can add blocks to the chain and are thus not decentralized, whereas permissionless blockchains such as Bitcoins do not. This difference is fundamental. Permissioned blockchains can use well-established and relatively efficient techniques such as Byzantine fault tolerance and thus don't have significant carbon footprints. These techniques ensure that each node in the network has performed the same computation on the same data to arrive at the same state for the next block in the chain. This is a consensus mechanism. In principle, each node in a permissionless blockchain's network can perform a different computation on different data to arrive at a different state for the next block in the chain. Which of these blocks ends up in the chain is determined by a randomized, biased election mechanism. For example, in proof-of-work blockchains such as Bitcoins, a node wins election by being the first to solve a puzzle. The length of time it takes to solve the puzzle is random, but the probability of being first is biased. It's proportional to the compute power the node uses. Initially, because of network latencies, nodes may disagree as to the next block in the chain, but eventually it will become clear which block gained the most acceptance among the nodes. This is why a Bitcoin transaction should not be regarded as final until it's 6 blocks from the head. Discussing blockchains and their externalities without specifying permissionless or permissioned is meaningless. They're completely different technologies. One is 30 years old, the other is 13 years old. Because there is no central authority controlling who can participate, decentralized consensus systems must defend against civil attacks, in which the attacker creates a majority of seemingly independent participants, which are secretly under his control. The defense is to ensure that the reward for a successful civil attack is less than the cost of mounting it. Thus, participation in a permissionless blockchain must be expensive, meaning miners must be reimbursed for their costly efforts. There's no central authority capable of collecting funds from users and distributing them to the miners in proportion to these efforts. Thus, miners' reimbursement must be generated organically by the blockchain itself. A permissionless blockchain needs a cryptocurrency to be secure. Because miners' OPEX and CAPEX costs cannot be paid in the blockchain's cryptocurrency, Exchanges are required to enable the rewards for mining to be converted into fiat currency to pay these costs. Someone needs to be on the other side of these sell orders. The only reason to be on the buy side of these orders is the belief that number go up. Thus, the exchanges need to attract speculators in order to perform their function. Thus, a permissionless blockchain requires a cryptocurrency to function, and this cryptocurrency requires speculation to function. Why are economies of scale a fundamental problem for decentralized systems? Participation must be expensive, and so will be subject to economies of scale. They will drive the system to centralize. So the expenditure in attempting to ensure that the system is decentralized is a futile waste. Most cryptocurrencies impose these costs, as our earlier system did, using proof of work. It was a brilliant idea when Cynthia Dwork and Moni Nair originated it in 1992, being both simple and effective. But when it's required to make participation expensive enough for a $1 trillion cryptocurrency, it has an unsustainable carbon footprint. The leading source for estimating Bitcoin's electricity consumption is the Cambridge Bitcoin Energy Consumption Index, whose current central estimate is 125 terawatt hours a year. Adjusting Christian Stoll et al.'s 2018 estimate of Bitcoin's carbon footprint to the current CBECI estimate gives a range of about 53 to 134 megatons of CO2 a year for Bitcoin's OPEX emissions, or between Portugal and Myanmar. Unfortunately, this is likely to be a considerable underestimate. Bitcoin's growing e-waste problem by Alex DeVries and Christian Stoll concludes that Bitcoin's annual e-waste generation adds up to 30.7 metric kilotons as of May 2021. This level is comparable to the small IT equipment waste produced by a country such as the Netherlands. That's an average of one whole MacBook Air of e-waste per economically meaningful transaction. The reason for this extraordinary waste is that the profitability of mining depends on the energy consumed per hash, and the rapid development of mining ASICs means that they rapidly become uncompetitive. DeVries and Stoll estimate that the average service life is less than 16 months. This mountain of e-waste contains embedded carbon emissions from its manufacture, transport, and disposal. These graphs show that for Facebook and Google data centers, CapEx emissions are at least as great as their OPEX emissions. Cryptocurrencies assume that society is committed to this waste of energy and hardware forever. Their response is frantic greenwashing, such as claiming that because Bitcoin mining allows an obsolete, uncompetitive coal-burning plant near St. Louis to continue burning coal, it's somehow good for the environment. But they argue mining can use renewable energy. First, at present, it doesn't. For example, Luxfolio implemented their commitment to 100% renewable energy by buying 15 megawatts of coal-fired power from the Navajo Nation. Second, even if it were true that cryptocurrencies ran on renewable power, the idea that it's okay for speculation to waste vast amounts of renewable power assumes that doing so doesn't compete with more socially valuable uses for renewables, or indeed for power in general. Right now, the world is short of power. One major reason that China banned cryptocurrency mining was that they needed their limited supplies of power to keep factories running and homes warm. Shortage of energy isn't a short-term problem. This graph is from Peak Oil and the Low Carbon Energy Transition and Net Energy Perspective by Louis Delanoy et al., showing that as the easiest deposits are exploited first, the energy return on investment, measuring the fraction of the total energy extracted delivered to consumers, decreases. Delanoy et al.'s figure 1 shows the gross and net oil energy history and projects it to 2050. The gross energy, and thus the carbon emission, peaks around 2035. But because the energy used in extraction, the top yellow band, increases rapidly, the net energy peaks in about 5 years. This is a problem for two reasons. If society is to survive, carbon emissions need to start decreasing now, not in a decade and a half. and renewables need to be deployed very rapidly. Deploying renewables consumes energy, which is paid back during their initial operation. Thus, the current transition to renewable power consumes energy, reducing that available for other uses. The world cannot afford to waste a Netherlands' worth of energy on speculation that could instead be deploying renewables. If cryptocurrency speculation is to continue, it needs to vastly reduce its carbon footprint by eliminating proof of work. The two major candidates are proof of space and time and proof of stake. Proof of space and time attempts to make participation expensive by wasting storage instead of computation. The highest profile such effort is Bram Cohen's Chia, funded by Andreessen Horowitz, the SoftBank of crypto. Chia's space farmers create and store plots consisting of large amounts of otherwise useless data. The software was ingenious, but the design suffered from naivete about storage markets and media. When it launched in May, gullible farmers rushed to buy hard disks and SSDs. By July, the capital tied up in farming hardware was around 6 times the market cap of the Chia coin. Chia's CEO described the result. We've kind of destroyed the short-term supply chain. Disk vendors were forced to explain that Chia farming voided the media's warranty. Just as with GPUs, the used market was flooded with burnt-out storage. Chia's coin initially traded at $1,934 before dropping more than 90%. Last I looked, it was $79. I expect A16Z made money, but everyone else has to deal with the costs. Chia doesn't use much electricity, more to do with failure than with the technology, but it does have a major e-waste problem. The costs that proof of stake imposes to make participation expensive are the risk of loss and the foregone liquidity of the stake, an escrowed amount of the cryptocurrency itself. This has two philosophical problems. It isn't just that the Gini coefficients of cryptocurrencies are extremely high, but the proof of stake makes this a self-reinforcing problem. Because the rewards for mining new blocks and the fees for including transactions in blocks flow to the holders in proportion to their holdings, whatever Gini coefficient the systems start out with will always increase. Proof of stake isn't effective at decentralization. And cryptocurrency whales are believers in number go up. The eventual progress of their coin to the moon means that the temporary costs of staking are irrelevant. There are also a host of severe technical problems. The accomplished Ethereum team have been making a praiseworthy effort to overcome them for more than 7 years and are still more than a year away from being able to migrate off proof of work. Vitalik Buterin pointed out that lack of decentralization was a security risk in 2017, and this was amply borne out last year when Justin Sun conspired with 3 exchanges, staking their customers' coins to take over the Steem proof-of-stake blockchain. Pushing back against the economic forces centralizing these systems is extremely difficult. The advantage of permissionless over permissioned blockchains is claimed to be decentralization. How has that worked out in practice? As has been true for the last 7 years, no more than 5 mining pools control the majority of Bitcoin mining power. And last November, 2 pools controlled the majority of Ethereum mining. Makarov and Shor write, 6 out of the largest mining pools are registered in China and have strong ties to Bitmain Technologies, which is the largest producer of Bitcoin mining hardware. It isn't just the mining pools that are centralized. The top 10% of miners control 90%, and just 0.1%, about 50 miners, control close to 50% of mining capacity. As Adam F.A. Genser et al. Pointed out, a Byzantine quorum system of size 20 could achieve better decentralization than proof-of-work mining at a much lower resource cost. That's the only reason for the massive carbon footprint of proof-of-work and the complexity and risk of the alternatives is to maintain the illusion of decentralization. Alas, it's unlikely that any alternative defense against civil attacks will be widely enough adopted to mitigate proof-of-work's carbon emissions. Immutability is one of the 2 things that make the cryptocurrency crime wave so effective. These systems are brittle. Make a single momentary mistake and your assets are irretrievable. Immutability sounds like a great idea when everything is going according to plan, but in the real world, mistakes are inevitable. Let's take a few recent examples. The $23 million fee Bitfinex paid for 100,000 transactions, or the $19 million oopsie at Index Finance, or the $31 million oopsie at MonoX, or the $90 million oopsie at Compound, and the subsequent $67 million oopsie, all of which left the perpetrators pleading with the beneficiaries to return the loot. And in Compound's case, threatening its customers with the ultimate crypto punishment, reporting them to the IRS. $12 billion in DeFi theft so far, or about 5% of all the funds. Vulnerabilities are equally inevitable, as we see with the $38 million, $19 million, and $130 million hacks of Cream Finance last year, the $115 million hack of Badger DAO, the $196 million hack of Bitmart, the recent $323 million hack of Wormhole, and of course, the $600 million hack of Poly Network. Because Ethereum and similar cryptocurrencies are programming environments, their attack surface is much larger than Bitcoin's. Now that DeFi and NFT protocols are implemented as smart contracts in these environments, the attack surface has expanded much further. One example is the rash of hacks involving the hijacks of the Discord servers of the communities surrounding them to lure victims into authenticating their wallets to malign smart contracts. Another is the flood of rug pulls buried in the smart contracts implementing NFTs. Yet another is described in Dan Goodin's How $323 million in crypto was stolen from a blockchain bridge called Wormhole. Because there are many completing blockchains, bridges exist to provide liquidity between them. Last month, Vitalik Buterin provided a detailed explanation of why they are a fundamental security problem. A smart contract called a Guardian locks up coins on one blockchain and unlocks the same number on another. But in this case, the Guardian failed to properly validate signatures. 3 days later, a bug in another bridge was exploited for $4.3 million. The centralization of Ethereum's mining pools and exchanges enabled Poly Network to persuade them to blacklist the addresses involved. This made it very difficult for the miscreant to escape with the loot, much of which was returned. But it also vividly demonstrated that in most blockchains, it's the mining pools that decide which transactions make it into a block and are thus executed. The small number of dominant mining pools can effectively prevent addresses from transacting and can prioritize transactions from favored addresses. They can also allow transactions to avoid the public mempool, which turned out to be useful when a small group of white hats discovered a vulnerability in a smart contract holding $9.6 million. The key point of escaping the dark forest, Samsung's account of their night's work, is that after the group spotted the vulnerability and built a transaction to rescue the funds, they could not put the rescue transaction in the public mempool because it would have been front-run by a bot. They had to find a miner who would put the transaction in a block without it appearing in the mempool. In other words, their transaction needed a dark pool, and they had to trust the cooperative miner not to front-run it. Ethereum is fortunately very far from decentralized, being centralized around a small number of large pools. Thus, the group needed a trusted pool, not an individual miner. At the time, the three largest pools mined more than half the blocks between them. So only 3 cores would have been needed to have a very good chance that the transaction would appear in one of the next few blocks. Most activity in trustless cryptocurrencies actually uses trusted third parties, exchanges, that are layered above the blockchain itself. These use conventional web-based identities and provide another layer of centralization. Binance, the dominant exchange, does 2 out of every 3 derivative transactions and half of all the spot transactions. Exchanges are routinely compromised. In most cases, immutability means the pilfered funds are not recovered. But more fundamentally, the entire cryptocurrency ecosystem depends upon a trusted third party, Tether, which acts as a central bank issuing the stable coins that cryptocurrencies are priced against and traded in. This is despite the fact that Tether is known to be untrustworthy, having consistently lied about its reserves. The other main enabler of the cryptocurrency crime spree is the prospect of transactions that aren't merely immutable, but are also anonymous. Anonymity for small transactions is important, but for large transactions, it provides the infrastructure for major crime. In the physical world, cash is anonymous, but it has the valuable property that the cost and difficulty of transacting increase strongly with size. KYC, AML, and other regulations leverage this. Cryptocurrencies lack this property. The ease with which cryptocurrency can be transferred between institutions that do and do not observe the KYC, AML regulations means that absent robust actions by the US, the KYC, AML regime is doomed. The most serious crime enabled by anonymity is ransomware, which is regularly crippling essential infrastructure such as oil pipelines and hospital systems, to say nothing of the losses to businesses large and small. This business is estimated to gross 5.2 billion a year and is growing rapidly, aided by a network of specialist service providers. There are cryptocurrencies that provide almost complete anonymity using sophisticated cryptography. For example, Monero. Observers cannot decipher addresses trading Monero, transactions amounts, address balances, or transaction histories. Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies are pseudonymous, not anonymous. Anyone can create and use an essentially unlimited number of pseudonyms, addresses, but transactions and balances using them are public. A newly minted pseudonym cannot be de-anonymized, but as it becomes enmeshed in the public web of transactions, maintaining anonymity takes more operational security than most users can manage, as we see in the statement of facts justifying the recent arrest of a couple for laundering the proceeds of the 2016 Bitfinex hack. Users are aware of the risk that their transactions can be traced, so many engage in wash trade transactions between addresses they control and use mixers and tumblers to mingle their coins with those of other miscreants. Because it's almost impossible to actually buy legal goods with Bitcoin, at some point a holder needs to use an exchange to obtain fiat currency. This risks having their identity connected into the web of transactions on the blockchain. Makarov and Shor conclude 90% of the transaction volume on the Bitcoin blockchain is not tied to economically meaningful activities, but is the byproduct of the Bitcoin protocol design, as well as the preference of many participants for anonymity. In other words, 90% of Bitcoin's carbon footprint is used in a partially successful attempt to compensate for its deficient anonymity. Although the techniques used to implement decentralization are effective in theory, at scale, emergent economic effects render them ineffective. Despite this, decentralization is fundamental to the cryptocurrency ideology, making mitigation of its externalities effectively impossible. Because there are existing alternatives that provide greatly increased anonymity, attempts to mitigate the externalities of pseudonymous cryptocurrencies are likely to be self-defeating. As the ransomware industry shows, users will migrate to these alternatives, reducing the effectiveness of chain analysis. We can conclude that permissioned blockchains do not need a cryptocurrency to defend against civil attacks, and thus do not have significant externalities. Permissionless blockchains require a cryptocurrency and thus necessarily impose all the externalities I've described, except the carbon footprint. If successful, permissionless blockchains using proof of work or any other way to waste a real resource as a civil defense have unacceptable carbon footprints. Whatever civil defense they use, economics forces successful permissionless blockchains to centralize. There's no justification for wasting resources in a doomed attempt at decentralization. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of centralization. I started building a decentralized permissionless system almost a quarter century ago. It would be wonderful if we could figure out how to build a web that would resist centralization. But all the technical and financial cleverness that's been poured into cryptocurrencies hasn't succeeded in doing that. Why? It's because it isn't about the technology. I'm a big believer in Bill Joy's law of startups. Success is inversely proportional to the amount of money you have. Right now, there is way too much money. If a system is to be decentralized, it has to have a low barrier to entry. If it has a low barrier to entry, competition will ensure it has low margins. Low margin businesses don't attract venture capital. VCs are pouring money into cryptocurrency and Web3 companies. This money is not going to build systems with low barriers to entry and thus low margins. Thus, the systems that will result from this flood of money will not be decentralized, no matter what the sales pitch says. Despite all the cleverness and hype, the technology just isn't that good. It's both extraordinarily inefficient and extraordinarily insecure. Nicholas Weaver points out that the Ethereum computer is 1/5000th as powerful as a Raspberry Pi, and that for the cost of 1 second of its use, you can buy nearly 60 Raspberry Pis. Moxie Marlinspike exploits the fact that an NFT is a link to a file of metadata that links to the image it purports to represent, so neither is guaranteed to exist or be valid. You have only to glance at Molly White's Web3 is going just great timeline to wonder why anyone thinks that this wretched hive of scum and villainy should be the future of the web. Thank you for your attention. And I am, where's the stop sharing thing?
Usually at the bottom. Thank you for that talk, David. That was wonderful. It was great to see the different types of currencies and see a lot of the pitfalls that they can fall into. Before we get to questions, I want to hand it over to Bryce and give our next speaker the floor.
Yes, thank you. And David, great to hear your talk. Give me 1 second to pull up my can you see the PowerPoint? It shouldn't be on full screen yet. Okay.
Yes, looks
okay.
good.
Great. So thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Bryce Webster Jacobson. I am Director of Intelligence Operations at GroupSense. We are a threat intelligence firm, and we happen to do some ransomware negotiation as well. So I will be talking about the role of cryptocurrency in security, but specifically as it relates to cybercrime, ransomware, and other types of cybercrime. So I want to start by just setting the stage and talking a little bit about how cryptocurrency is used in cybercrime across the board. So obviously we've talked a little bit about ransomware operations, and I will dig into more specifics about the role of cryptocurrency in ransomware operations and ransomware attacks. But we also see cryptocurrency as the primary currency for all of the day-to-day dark web transactions. And what do I mean by day-to-day dark web transactions? I mean the sale of data, whether that be lists of compromised credentials or usernames, lists of payment card information, so PCI data, day-to-day transactions being network access that is offered on the dark web. So let's say you work for a company that uses a VPN, and the credentials to log into that VPN have been exposed in some way to a threat actor who then wants to sell those credentials to another cyber threat actor, potentially a ransomware actor, who would want to conduct a cyber attack against that organization. So if I were a cyber criminal, which I am not, I would go on the dark web and see that offer, have a conversation with the threat actor offering that set of credentials, and then we would exchange payment for credentials. And there's an honor system and a lot that goes into it, but the actual currency used to conduct that transaction would be a cryptocurrency, traditionally Bitcoin, but we'll talk a little bit about the nuances in a second. And then also purchasing data through other non-traditional communication channels. And what I mean by non-traditional communication channels, these are alternative communication platforms outside of the dark web. So not a marketplace or a forum on the dark web, but maybe it's a Discord server that the threat actor is operating where they are selling the same data that they would be selling on the dark web. Or maybe it's a Telegram channel where they are posting new credentials that they're offering or that they've been able to exploit. In all of these types of transactions, cryptocurrency is used. They're not, threat actors are not sending each other cash through the mail. Cryptocurrency has really enabled and facilitated these transactions to spread and has enabled threat actors to easily transact across national borders and given them one unified method to conduct these transactions. Now, cryptocurrencies are not the only way that we're seeing this data exchange, but they are the primary tool used to exchange for these exchanges. So what are some of the crypto preferences of the cyber underground? Primarily Bitcoin. Bitcoin is largely used and widely accepted across all of the ransomware operations, dark web forums, alternative communication channels. In our day-to-day business, if we're posing as a potential buyer of data on the dark web, but we can guarantee that the threat actor we're talking to will at least have a Bitcoin wallet that we can transact with. Now, threat actors do have some privacy concerns when it comes to Bitcoin, as David mentioned, with the traceability. There are some Bitcoin exchanges that follow KYC AML regulations, but not all do. There are also what are referred to as on-chain intelligence providers. These are tools that allow you to gather some data on the Bitcoin transactions as they move along the blockchain and trace the transactions from one wallet to another, to another, to another, to another, and eventually back to where the Bitcoin you're paying is going. So threat actors are wise to these privacy concerns and do take steps to mitigate those privacy concerns. Less commonly used, but still occasionally used, is Monero. Monero doesn't have the same privacy concerns for the threat actors because there are not the same on-chain intelligence tools that we see with Bitcoin or Ethereum. So Monero is starting to become more popular among threat actors, so they don't have to think about covering their tracks or take as many operational security steps as they would when using Bitcoin. And we do see some ransomware operators that prefer using Monero and have offered discounts if a ransom is paid in Monero. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit. And lastly, I did want to talk about altcoins. I know there are a laundry list of meme coins and alternative cryptocurrencies. And we do occasionally get asked about whether those are used by cyber criminals. They are not. We don't frequently see or ever see threat actors that are using like Dogecoin or some other meme coin. Those do not have they are not accepted and not used on the cyber underground. So a quick overview of the state of the ransomware market. David talked a little bit about this, but as GroupSense is a firm that conducts ransomware negotiations, has been for a few years now, and as one of our lead ransomware negotiators, we've seen some evolution in the ransomware market over the last couple of years. And so I think it's good to understand the state of the ransomware market. There were over 500 million attempted ransomware attacks in 2021. That sounds like a huge number. It is. Where that number comes from is ransomware attacks start with a simple, as simple as using stolen credentials. If I gave you my email and password, you could start to conduct a ransomware attack that will give you initial access to my company's network, and you can, as a sophisticated hacker, could pivot from that initial compromise, pivot around our network, gain access, exfiltrate the data, and then take your actions on objectives, encrypt our network using some sort of ransomware variant. So for 500 million attempted ransomware attacks, that is attempted phishing delivery or delivery of malicious content through phishing, attempted credential stuffing attacks. So there have been hundreds of millions of ransomware attacks or attempted ransomware attacks over the last year. Ransomware groups are starting to exfiltrate data without actually encrypting the network. So it's an evolution on a ransomware attack, as previously ransomware attacks started as a threat actor gaining access to a victim's network, moving laterally within that network, and then encrypting their servers and demanding a payment for the decryption key to allow the company to resume operations. What we're starting to see is that ransomware groups are exfiltrating data first before encrypting the network, because they know that enterprises typically have backups and are able to recover from a ransomware attack by restoring from backup. So the ransomware group has a large tranche of your data, hundreds of gigabytes, in some cases terabytes of data, that they claim they will release if you do not pay the ransom. Then that changes the calculation of the negotiation. You may recover from backup, but you still have not completely mitigated the threat, as the threat actors have a copy of your data that they potentially could release. We are now starting to see some groups even conduct a ransomware attack by not even encrypting the network, but simply exfiltrating the data and then extorting the victim for payment to supposedly delete the data. And ransomware groups are starting to evolve and learn from others' mistakes. So as ransomware groups make a mistake in their attempts to launder Bitcoin, some other ransomware operators are going to learn from that and are going to take steps to alter their objectives. So one common tactic that we're now seeing is ransomware operators are not using the same. They're using unique wallets for each transaction because they know that we have on-chain intelligence tools that can show us what transactions have gone into the wallet that they provide us, and so they don't want us to know that they're connected to previous attacks. We're also seeing that the practice of data exfiltration is becoming widely accepted across the ransomware space. The Great Resignation has started to lead to overworked cybersecurity teams, and I'm sure there are a number of cybersecurity professionals on this webinar who are saying, wait, I was overworked before everyone started resigning from their jobs, and that is also true. But we're starting, with the amount of people moving around jobs, and we're starting to see some organizations that are not able to keep up with the prevention techniques that may need to be employed to prevent ransomware attacks. There's been a rise in access brokers in the ransomware group supply chain. So access brokers are those threat actors that are offering that initial access to a victim's network. So when I was talking earlier about potentially buying VPN credentials on the dark web, or some sort of exploit for a vulnerability on a client's network or on a corporate network, that's referred to as initial access. And there are access brokers that are selling those that data or that exploit to ransomware groups for a cut of the end of the final payment in the once the ransomware has been delivered and the negotiation has been settled. So we're starting to see ransomware groups that are actually recruiting access brokers, specific access brokers with really good techniques or high degree of sophistication in their particular craft. And they're recruiting talent in the same way that I would recruit talent for my team. They're trying to identify individual access brokers that have a strong record of success. But the top attack vectors are remaining the same year after year. Reusing credentials, password reuse, and brute force attacks on credentials. Or credential stuffing attacks. So while some of the techniques are becoming more sophisticated, the easiest attack vectors will continue to be exploited by ransomware operators, and will continue to provide targets for their attacks. So let's talk a little bit about the role of cryptocurrency in a ransomware attack. So ransomware operators are, again, conducting and demanding payments in cryptocurrency. We're not seeing ransomware operators asking for demanding ransom in US dollars or payment in pound or euro or any other traditional currency. They are asking for cryptocurrencies. And this is an evolution from the early days of ransomware attacks. The first ransomware attacks were in the late 80s. And we're simply threat actors mailing floppy disks and with some malicious code on it, having victims put those into their computer, encrypting their network, and dropping a note that said, mail me a check or a cashier's check or some other payment in US dollars to this address, and I'll send you the key to decrypt your network. We've seen the evolution now since cryptocurrency, particularly Bitcoin, has become more ubiquitous, that ransomware operators are conducting their negotiations and demanding payment in cryptocurrency. Typically, those ransomware operators are demanding payment in Bitcoin, but we can talk a little bit about it in a second. There are some operators that are starting to demand payment in other currencies. Threat actors are using disposable wallets, as I mentioned before. So these are wallets, one-time wallets that they will send to a victim. It's a unique wallet sent to each victim, so that there's no pre-existing transactions or intelligence that you can gain from transactions on their wallets. And the threat actors are sometimes letting the ransom payment sit in that disposable wallet or that one-time wallet for months before even moving the money around. They know victims and law enforcement and cybersecurity professionals do have the ability to track those payments and will trace the payments if it's done in Bitcoin. So they will try to wait them out. We've seen, I've personally worked on a case that we made a payment of over $1 million in Bitcoin to a ransomware operator. And that initial payment sat in the destination wallet, which was a new wallet spun up just for that attack, for over 6 months. They hadn't transferred the money out, and they were hoping that we would just continue to wait and not trace that money, or that law enforcement would move on to the next attack. We've also seen ransomware operators who use a disposable wallet and transfer the money out within 30 minutes of payment, which kind of doesn't necessarily throw us off the trail. We just continue to follow the money as soon as we make the payment. So we had one case that we made a payment within 30 minutes. It had moved to another wallet, and then by the end of the day, it was on its 6th or 7th wallet. So ransomware operators will move the funds out of those disposable wallets at various speeds, but we do see typically that they're going to be using a new wallet for each transaction. I mentioned that the cryptocurrency is laundered after the initial transaction. So we see ransomware operators that will move the cryptocurrency, particularly Bitcoin, through a series of wallets and a series of mixers to try to throw law enforcement off their trail and make it more difficult to trace that transaction. So typically when a ransomware attack is finished and payment is made, there are many people that get paid on the ransomware operator side. It's not one individual. We're seeing more sophisticated operations, more organized groups that have distinct roles. And so maybe the initial access broker gets 10%, and the group kind of the manager of the group or the kingpin of the ransomware operation will get 80%, and then that will then be distributed among their deputies. And we're able to trace through the mixers and kind of through the series of wallets, and then start to see the payments splitting off into other individual wallets. So ransomware operators are typically trying to launder the cryptocurrency after the payment is made, in order to throw ransomware or law enforcement off their trail. Some of the more sophisticated ransomware operators are negotiating in multiple cryptocurrencies, and that's what the screenshot below shows. So this is an actual screenshot from a negotiation that we conducted with Black Matter ransomware group. You can see that you can see a few things on the screen. One, you can see the price now, the time to end, and the time after, or the after time ends. So ransomware operators will use a clock or some sort of countdown to try to entice you to pay, or entice the victim to pay earlier. That's when their demand will increase. So if you look under now, you'll see Bitcoin and Monero. Next to Bitcoin, it says with 25% fee. So the demand, if the victim was going to pay the demand in Bitcoin, the ransomware operator wanted to charge a 25% premium. And this is because of security and traceability of Bitcoin. They preferred that we would pay in Monero. So there was virtually no chance that law enforcement would be able to track that transaction. And this is crafty. Threat actors are aware of the operational security concerns of using Bitcoin, but they also know that Bitcoin is easier for corporations to acquire than Monero is. However, because of the increasing scrutiny on large ransomware transactions and the increasing amount of US-based Bitcoin exchanges starting to use KYC and AML regulations or follow KYC and AML regulations, it can become increasingly difficult for corporate ransomware victims to acquire large sums of cryptocurrency. There's not many reasons that a large reputable organization in the US is going to acquire millions of dollars of cryptocurrency overnight, or need to acquire millions of dollars of Bitcoin overnight. And so the exchanges are starting to get wise and do not want to be involved in ransomware transactions. So it can be difficult for an organization to acquire, let's say, $2 million in Bitcoin in 24 hours. We've conducted a negotiation where the exchange was limiting the amount of Bitcoin that we could acquire at one time, limiting us to about 2 Bitcoin per day. And as you can see, some of the demands are in the tens of Bitcoins, sometimes hundreds of Bitcoins. So the deal that we had achieved with the ransomware operator was in jeopardy because they were expecting payment much quicker than we were able to actually acquire Bitcoin on behalf of the corporate victim. So I think that's all I have for my slides, and I can stop sharing my screen and open up for questions.
Great, thank you, Bryce. That was really interesting to see how the interaction between the ransomware and the cryptocurrencies progresses. I'd like to hand it over now to Mark, who's going to coordinate the questions and lead us through the end here. Oh, Mark, you're on mute.
Some people say I talk best when I'm on mute. I'd like to start with one question. In my memory is that there is a Bitcoin exchange which has been a victim of ransomware fairly recently. It seems kind of interesting. I wonder if you have some comment on that, Bryce.
Yes, I am blanking on the exchange itself. I believe it was a Korean-based exchange. Yeah, and so yeah, they were a victim of a ransomware attack, and it was they face the same issues that a ransom or a Bitcoin exchange faces the same vulnerabilities that any other software or financial institution or enterprise could face. They have some of the same entry vectors or initial access vectors for threat actors.
So how did they pay the ransom?
I don't know the specifics of how they paid the ransom. They probably, and I don't know if they actually paid a ransom. Not all ransomware victims pay a ransom. There are a number of victims that we've worked with that ultimately decide not to pay a ransom. And there are plenty of victims that don't even ever engage with the ransomware operators. They restore from backup, they move on from the attack, and can deal with the outcome of data being released on the dark web.
Okay.
There's a long history of exchanges being compromised in various ways, mostly not to ransomware them, but to steal the currency they are holding, which is the way that it happened with Bitfinex in the case that's resulted in 2 recent arrests.
So David, you did a great job of describing why the cryptocurrencies are not secure, and why we can expect more as the value of these things go up. We can expect more and more, should we call them breaches?
Yes, I think it's
there's a question.
But actually compromising the blockchain itself is quite hard, at least until quantum cryptography happens. The breaches are all in the technology that surrounds it, exchanges, wallet software, man-in-the-middle attacks to retrieve people's keys, things like that.
So we do know that there's a form of anyway. Before we go down that, there is a question from the audience about, do ransomware criminals ever get caught?
Yes, rarely, but they do, and we're starting to see more international cooperation, let's say, on arresting ransomware operators. So one thing is to consider is where are operators based, and we can caveat with all the difficulties of identifying individuals who are conducting ransomware attacks, but many ransomware operators are based in permissive countries that are not as impacted by ransomware attacks. So many ransomware groups have put out statements that they will not target former Soviet country or companies in former Soviet countries or CIS countries. And so, if there's less motivation or incentive for governments like Russia or Ukraine to go after cyber criminals in their country. Now we are seeing more action by Russia recently. There was a group of 6, I believe, criminals associated with the REvil ransomware operation. That's a well-known ransomware operation that has conducted numerous large-scale cyber attacks against U.S. businesses and businesses in Europe and around the world. We've also recently seen a Canadian individual who was arrested for working with a ransomware operation as well. And in that case, the federal authorities were able to recover around $30 million in Bitcoin from that individual. So we do see occasionally ransomware operators who get arrested, but even in the case of REvil or some of the other higher profile arrests, it's never the it's never the full operation. And often the amount that's seized and returned is significantly less than the amount that ransomware operation has generated throughout their activities.
Well,
so
thank you, Bryce. We have about 1 minute left, David. This whole question of law enforcement actually being able to track cryptocurrencies to arrest people kind of bubbled up in this recent arrest of these 2 people. And I wonder if you would like to comment on that in our last minute.
Yeah, yes, I've been working on a blog post for tomorrow about that. In this particular case, there was a break early on. The coins were moved from Bitfinex to a wallet, and with some of the coins then were used were deposited at AlphaBay, which was a dark web market, and either before that or shortly after that, law enforcement compromised AlphaBay, and they were therefore able to connect the deposits of money, of Bitcoins, to AlphaBay with subsequent withdrawals, which went to accounts that they could connect to Liechtenstein, one of the 2 people who were arrested. And that enabled early on the authorities to identify Liechtenstein as someone who was likely at least a launderer, if not a participant in the heist. And so they were able to watch his transactions quite carefully. And it took a long time for them to get to the point where they could have enough to justify an arrest warrant. The second key break, well, actually the third key break, let's not get too technical, was that they managed to decrypt a file that they had acquired through a search of one of his cloud accounts. And this file contained the keys for almost all the wallets that he used in the laundering process. They were able to move about 20% of the coins that were initially stolen, and the 80% was seized by the authorities because they got the key in this decrypted file. There's a lot of wonderful detail in the statement of facts that they filed to justify the warrant, and it's well worth a read.
So this has been a really great session, and it's a kind of a tangled web. So we're seeing that cryptocurrencies are controlled by a small group of people who can actually do dark transactions, and that ransomware is growing, and that the exchanges themselves are becoming victims of ransomware attacks. And so there's this kind of circular, and then all of the environmental damage that this whole thing is doing. We just got a beginning, we just kind of opened up the whole subject today. We're planning to have a more discussion-based follow-up in a few months, and I'm hoping that you both will be able to join us for that. Thank you. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you. Those were both wonderful talks. And thanks to all of our participants and speakers. It was great. And we'll have another webinar again soon. If you have any questions, feel free to write us at basesecurity.org. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.